All right. Well, we better get going. They can jump in when they come on. So good afternoon. Welcome to the 5th installment of NEWMOA's Materials Management 101 for state staff. I'm John Fay, project manager at NEWMOA, and I will be the moderator today with the help of Melissa Lavoie, our executive director. And this series of webinars is intended as a primer on solid waste management topics for state staff that are new to their agency or would just like to brush up on a particular subject. Recordings of past webinars and registration for upcoming ones are available on the NEWMOA website on the training tab of the materials management program. So if you go to programs, materials management, go to the training tab, you can see all the old ones and the upcoming ones. Today's webinar is on extended producer responsibility, known as EPR. Before we get started, I'd like to review some housekeeping details. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and transcribed by Teams. Please keep your microphones on mute during the presentation unless you'd like to ask a question in the moment. Resa has been kind enough to say that she can be interrupted during the thing if there's something pertinent. We do have the chat disabled, so we'll be using the Q&A feature and we'll be monitoring that as we go. And then at the end of the presentation, we're going to open it up for Q&A, hopefully for about 20 minutes. All right, well, today we do have a fantastic presenter for you. It's Resa Dimino of Signalfire Group. Resa is a leading expert on EPR policy, and we are very fortunate to have her here today. I think I'll let her give more of an introduction to herself and turn it on over. Take it away, Resa.
Thanks so much, John. Very happy to be here with you all, and good to see some familiar names there. For those of you who there's certainly a number of folks on the line who know as much about EPR as I do, so hope I can add some value here as we move through our discussion. As John said, I'm a managing partner at the Signalfire Group. The Signalfire Group is a fairly new consultancy. We opened about 2.5 years ago, really recognizing the substantial uptick in interest in recycling-related policy and EPR policy specifically. The Signalfire Group partners include myself, Garth Hickel, who some of you may know, formerly of the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and David Stitzall out in Seattle. The three of us bring very different perspectives and skills to the questions around EPR and recycling-related policy. And we help our clients both in the public and private sector really understand what's happening in the policy landscape, understand the implications of policy for them, and try to understand how to formulate policy that really meets your needs and objectives moving forward. The Signalfire Group is a subsidiary of RRS. And I'm a managing principal in that company as well. RRS is a mission-driven recycling consultancy focused on materials recovery, organics recovery, and corporate sustainability. So we're going to talk a bit today about EPR, just the basics. What is it? How has it been used in the US? What kind of impacts does it have out there in the world? And then talk a little bit more specifically around EPR for packaging and printed paper, packaging and paper products, and other products that we're seeing come on the market under the EPR rubric, particularly in the Northeast. So, and as John said, I'm happy to take questions as we go through, happy to be more conversational. If folks have questions, feel free to pop in or put them in the Q&A. I'm happy to address as we go through. So very basically, extended producer responsibility is a policy approach and a practice that requires the producers of a product or a package to take responsibility for managing that product or package at the end of its useful life. That responsibility could be financial, it could be operational, and it's often a combination of the two. When we use the term producer, we really mean the brand owner in most instances. And so if you're thinking about packaging, it's not, the Pratt mill that makes the pizza box. It's Domino's, whose logo is on the pizza box, who has that responsibility. Similarly, it's not the mill that makes the cereal box. It's Kellogg's or General Mills that makes the cereal, who's the producer. So EPR has actually been around since before we used the term EPR. The earliest policies that really fit the EPR model in the United States are bottle bills, which we have a number of here in the Northeast. But the term EPR was really coined in 1990 in a report to the Swedish government as a new kind of policy approach to be utilized. And in Europe, it really focused initially and predominantly around packaging and later on electronics. But in the US, it really was applied most, post-bottle bill was really applied most robustly to products that are toxic or problematic to handle. So we started with rechargeable batteries and mercury switches, then moved into e-scrap and thermostats and fluorescent light bulbs. And then we started to focus on things that are bulky and difficult to handle for different ways, like paint, carpet, and that sort of thing. And then most recently, in the last few years, we've really started to work towards EPR for packaging and paper products in the United States as well. In the last couple of years, Connecticut has blazed a trail with a couple of new product items, gas cylinders and tires under EPR, first in the US programs, and then Vermont last year became the first in the US to establish an EPR program for HHW. So you can see we do use EPR for a wide variety of products, and a lot of states have utilized this for one product or another. So this just gives you a sense of the range of the types of products and the number of bills that are out there. So you can see things like mercury switches and thermostats, paint, electronics are all really common applications of the EPR framework. And you can see here the sort of hot button areas for EPR include many states in the Northeast, as well as those on the West Coast and the upper Midwest. This is pretty typical of if you were to map all recycling related policies, you'd get dark marks in these areas as well. These are the areas that tend to more heavily regulate around recycling and solid waste related issues. So as we think about, I mentioned before that EPR can require producer financial responsibility, can require operational responsibility, and often it's a combination. Here, we're just trying to show the spectrum of the different EPR programs that are out there and how they really vary on that spectrum of financial and operational responsibility. So in the upper right-hand corner, you see programs like rechargeable batteries and like the packaging and printed paper programs in British Columbia and Colorado that really require producers to take full financial and operational responsibility. So they're paying for the full program. They're also arranging for the recycling and essentially operating the programs either by contract or directly. And you kind of across the board, you see different variations on this theme. So in some cases, you have situations where there is more financial responsibility than operational, and I would put the main packaging and EPR program in that category. And somewhere there's very little operational or financial responsibility, like the California electronics program or the Oregon packaging program. But all of this is to say EPR can really take a lot of different approaches, and where it falls on this spectrum of operational and financial responsibility has to do with the context of the state, the infrastructure to manage this material, the objectives of the policymakers who are looking to implement EPR, and a whole host of issues here. So when we're looking at what makes EPR programs successful, as we've studied the performance of EPR programs over the years, we've found a few key things that are really critical to ensure good, strong programs. One is the convenience of collection. So we all know that people are more likely to participate in programs that are easy to access and easy to get to, and that holds true for EPR as well. Dedicated financing has also been a key element of success. So some of the programs that have fees, either visible to the consumer or not, have been more stable and high performing than those that are financed in a different manner, where the funding for the program might fight against another, the corporate bottom line or other needs within a company. It's really important as we develop EPR laws that we have clear lines of responsibility and accountability. Who does what is really key to lay out in these laws. What are the producers responsible for? What do municipalities have to do? What is the role of state? Performance standards are key. What's interesting in some of the research that we've done is we found in studying electronics that convenience standards are actually greater drivers of performance than kind of rates and dates. So you have to think about the product that you're targeting, the infrastructure that you have, and what is the appropriate performance standard. Some combination of convenience and rates and dates probably makes sense, but again, that's going to vary depending on the product and the infrastructure and that sort of thing. Incentives are key. We all know bottle bills work because they drive people to return their containers to get money back. Incentives have been used in thermostats and other programs as well. Those are important. And then oversight and enforcement is really key. We need to make sure that there is appropriate guidance and oversight. Other things that are helpful and important in EPR program, transparency. We've all been struggling out there with the public perceptions of, is this thing really getting recycled? What happens to my stuff? Should I even bother? EPR can provide really important transparency into the system by incorporating reporting requirements and other measures that ensure that we know where materials are going and someone is responsible for handling them appropriately. Environmental management standards also along those lines. A lot of the states, including those in the Northeast, have requirements for electronics, for example, of downstream due diligence and that sort of thing. Disposal bans can be really helpful as a part of EPR to really demonstrate you don't want to put these things in a landfill. You do want to return them through the EPR program. And then education and outreach, as we know, drives all the things. So as we look at developing EPR programs, there's essentially three core elements. One is the legislation. That's critical to make sure that you have those pieces we just talked about, performance standards, accountability, transparency, and that sort of thing, clear roles and responsibilities. The second is in most EPR programs, you have a producer responsibility organization or more than one producer responsibility organization. And this is an entity that is essentially created to help the producers meet their obligations under EPR laws and help implement these programs and help them collectively work toward a unified system. And then the third piece is a program plan. So that producer responsibility organization is going to put together a plan. And as my colleague Garth likes to say, the program plan is a regulatory instrument. That's where the PRO says, here's what we're going to do. Here's how who we're going to contract with. Here's what we're going to accomplish. And then that becomes the tool for the agency to determine whether or not programs is on target, determine whether or not the organization is meeting its objectives. So I'm going to go through these next pretty quickly because I'm a little concerned about running out of time. But some critical in the legislation that you have very clear requirements for responsibilities of brands, of retailers, of program operators, that sort of thing, performance standards and oversight, really critical that those be in the legislative structure. As I mentioned, the producer responsibility organization is essentially typically authorized in legislation essentially created to manage the obligations of the producers to meet legislative requirements. Essentially, they set fees, they collect fees, they pay service providers to make sure that programs run and program plans are implemented. The program plan is essentially that blueprint that that tells you how the program is going to operate. It might have, in the case of packaging, a list of recyclables. Who's going to collect material? How are they going to get paid? Where is that material going to get processed? What education and outreach is going to be done? What and market development is going to be done, etc. The program plan, as I said, regulatory instrument approved by the agency and really used by the agency as a tool to determine whether performance is on target. So a quick note on a financing mechanism. There's essentially two approaches to financing EPR programs. One is an eco fee. The other is cost internalization. An eco fee is essentially a fee that is added on a per product basis or a weight basis. And it's essentially paid by the producer to the PRO to cover the cost of managing its products at the end of its useful life. It creates a dedicated financing stream, which I mentioned earlier has been correlated to high program performance. In some cases, that fee can be visible to the consumer, as it is in the paint programs and the mattress programs and things things of that nature. It also can be paid at another point in the supply chain. So it doesn't necessarily need to be shown to the consumer in order to be an eco fee-based financing mechanism. The second method is cost internalization, and that is producers pay directly to the producer responsibility organization based on a fee schedule created by the PRO. In packaging, that's based on weight. You pay X amount per pound of boxboard that you sell into the state's marketplace. Things like batteries are paid based on units and battery type. So this is a pretty simple description that just tries to show the roles and responsibilities of different entities in EPR programs. And you'll see what's interesting here, I think, is that state agencies like yours are not in the center of driving programs in an EPR system, nor are local governments. The state agency is on the side here providing oversight, approving the plan, and enforcing requirements, but the producer responsibility organization is really in that central role. And essentially they're collecting fees from brand owners, and they're using the revenue from those fees to pay service providers, in some cases local governments, in some cases private companies, MRFs, processors, and markets to handle and manage materials. In the US, we're seeing an increase in the reliance on advisory groups or advisory boards, and these are entities that are essentially created to advise both the producer responsibility organization and the state agency on program implementation. And these boards, their role is really to make sure that programs are happening the way they should, make sure that the views and perspectives of different stakeholders are considered, to raise a flag if there are problems in implementation and things like that, or if a plan needs to be updated and that sort of thing. So why have we seen such an increase in the reliance on EPR policy in the last few years? I think the biggest reason is, despite the hard work of all of us, many of us on this line and around the country, we've been trying to build recycling programs. The recycling rate has not moved in decades. We're not making progress doing things the way we're doing them. So we need to take a different approach to try to increase diversion and increase recovery. With the current pressures that government is under, government doesn't have the resources to deliver really comprehensive and cohesive programs. And so EPR can provide that at no cost to government, reducing that government investment in recycling and materials management. The third piece is incorporating the cost of recycling or end-of-life management into the cost of the product. And here, this is really an equity concern. If you think about, for example, the cost of electronics recycling, we all know in states that don't have EPR, electronics recycling can be quite costly. If I am a techie and I am generating multiple electronics in a year and stressing my system, and my neighbor is a Luddite and generating none, if we have a system that's paid for out of our tax base, we're both paying the same amount for that system, but I'm using it much more than my neighbor is. And so in a tax-funded system that's not necessarily equitable, EPR incorporates the cost of managing that product at the end of its useful life into the cost of the product. I am therefore paying for that as I purchase those electronics. So it's a little bit more fair. And then the last piece is improving the design of products to reduce environmental impact. And I think this is the piece where EPR still has not fully reached that target or that goal. And I think that's an area where we still need to focus on how we improve and expand on that policy. Okay, so I'm going to quickly go through some impacts here. I want to start by saying it's pretty difficult to come up with great data on impacts. I'm going to share some information here from a study that we did when I was at the Product Stewardship Institute for the state of Connecticut. It's dated, but I think valuable and the most comprehensive data we've had in a while. So we looked at a few different products to see whether EPR increases recovery. And you can see in the years that EPR was implemented, the pretty substantial increase in e-waste collection and in mattresses recycled. Pretty clear improvement there. So does EPR increase recovery? Yes, it does. Same is true for thermostats and for paint. We looked across multiple programs, paint programs, looking at the year it started, 5 years operation, first year operations and 5 years after, and you can see across the board an increase over time of paint collection under EPR programs. E-scrap is a really interesting example because there are 25 state laws. They're all really different, and they have differing levels of structure. And I do want to say they also have different definitions of covered materials, and so the weight of what's covered can vary pretty dramatically. So take this with a little bit of a grain of salt, but you can see the programs that are more structured, the more structured electronics EPR programs tended to have higher levels of recovery than those without EPR or those with less structured programs. Big exception being Colorado, which had a disposal ban and an active program in place. We also looked in that study at the study we did for Connecticut at PSI. We also looked at local government cost savings, and you can see here the cost spent by Connecticut governments on paint management dropped substantially as EPR was implemented. Carpet recycling is another example. The recycling rate nationally for carpets is 9%. That's almost entirely due to California's recycling rate. There's very little recycling that happens anywhere else in the state, in the country. And you can see how this recycling rate in California has increased as the EPR program has been implemented. And as many know, the California Carpet EPR program is not anywhere near a model for great policy. It's been challenging to implement. And even in that challenging model, you've seen pretty substantial increase in recycling over time. Okay, so I'm just going to keep powering through unless people have questions. All right, let's talk about.
Sounds good. We don't have any comments yet in the Q&A, but I'll let you know.
Okay. I feel like I'm firing at all of you, but
I think we're all just listening.
All right. So packaging and printed paper. This just shows how EPR for packaging has really exploded globally over the last 20 years. In the year 2000, Europe had EPR, but not much else. And now much of the industrialized world has EPR in place, and now even a few states in the US. I should have updated this. Sorry, I should have updated this before today. Minnesota enacted EPR for packaging a couple weeks ago. So we now have 5 states with EPR for packaging. New York did not. Boo-hoo for all of us from New York. We took a swing and a miss last week. But you can see there's still active legislation in a number of states, both in the Northeast and elsewhere. And again, tremendous increase in activity over the last few years as compared to, the 10 or 15 years prior. So why are we seeing this dramatic increase in focus around EPR for packaging? I think probably the most critical piece has been post-National Sword, and this is certainly true more on the West Coast than here, but true here as well. It became really clear how fragile the economics of municipal recycling were when the Chinese government closed down that country to imports of recyclables from the US and market values dropped substantially. Many municipalities went from paying nothing for recycling or receiving some revenue for recycling to paying pretty substantial sums to fund their recycling programs. And I think it became really clear that municipalities are not very resilient funding sources. We're not really in a great position to absorb those kinds of financial and market fluctuations as governments. And so that created, it really sort of exposed a little bit of a little bit of a soft underbelly of the system. And I think at the same time, we have corporations who have set targets for recycled content and recycling rates and recyclability. And they were starting to realize that the system that we have can't deliver what they need in order to meet their corporate goals. So it was this confluence of interests from the local government side and from the system side and from the brand side to say, something's got to give. And then at the same time, again, recycling rates haven't moved for years. The Recycling Partnership and the Closed Loop Fund are excellent organizations doing excellent work. They've been doing this excellent work for 10 years, and it's still the recycling rates aren't moving. And so we need something different, and we need a more systemic approach, and that's what EPR is providing. So other products, I mentioned we use EPR for a variety of other things. We're seeing a lot of interest in batteries. in the last couple years, and again, driven by some of the safety concerns at MRFs and other factors, but really a substantial increase in focus on battery, EPR, carpet. New York was the second state to establish carpet EPR. We've got a number of bills that have been introduced in other states, most recently Connecticut, and some focus on that product as well. I mentioned Vermont was the first state to do EPR for HHW in the US. This is pretty broadly done in Canada, but not yet in the US. So this is really an important step forward in terms of capturing a costly and critically important part of the stream. EPR for tires, I mentioned, first in the nation. In Connecticut again, also a product where there's a lot of experience in Canada, but very little here. We at the Signalfire Group are working with the U.S. Tire Manufacturers Association to help them implement this law, create a tire stewardship organization, and provide free and convenient access to tire recycling across Connecticut. So that's exciting. And I think I will leave it at that. I'm sorry, I should have updated this after New Hampshire. You asked me to repeat what I did in New Hampshire, and I took that quite literally. So apologies for that. For those who don't know, I just got back from vacation, so didn't have a ton of time to prepare for this. But I think what we're seeing, as we look out there in the marketplace, there's a lot of experience with EPR. Many of you on the line have some of that significant experience. There are a lot of industries that are really interested in this. Paint, mattresses, batteries, electronics are all industries that have been super engaged. Looking at new things like tire, HHW, and carpet is going to be critical. And then, the big kahuna here is packaging. That's the big cost savings and the big opportunity moving forward. So we're hoping folks will continue to focus on that in the Northeast and around the country. So with that, did I babble enough at everyone?
Well, that was fantastic. Thank you, Resa. And yeah, so now let's open it up to anyone who would like to ask a question. You can type it on into the Q&A section, or I think you can unmute. If this is my first time doing it on Teams instead of Zoom, so we'll see how that goes. Well, maybe I'll start off the questions while people are thinking about it and diving in. The United States is different in a lot of ways because every single little state will enact their own laws and their own EPR laws, and each one will be a little bit different. And for manufacturers and PROs, that can create a patchwork that's difficult and costly to manage. Mm-hmm. Where do you see, as we have this EPR momentum going, especially with packaging, where do you see the future 10 years from now?
Well, I think, we have 5 packaging laws now. They're all pretty different in terms of what's covered and what the roles and responsibilities are for different entities. But the one thing that we do have is a single producer responsibility organization thus far. So the Circular Action Alliance has formed as the PRO for packaging, and they have been so far certified in every state that has gone through that process. So I would expect that they will continue to be the predominant producer responsibility organization, and that they'll start to work through some of these harmonization issues. There's a lot on packaging that can be done that's not controversial, that can be easier to harmonize. And so, for example, as state agencies, as you're looking at, potential legislation, it's helpful to look at things like the producer definition, right? That Washington State spent a lot of time negotiating a producer definition. They did a great job of it. That definition has essentially been adopted in Minnesota. Pieces of it were incorporated in the New York law that almost passed. And so if we start looking at things like producer definitions, like planning requirements, like reporting requirements, and start by making those sorts of things consistent, I think that can help a lot in terms of harmonization. Every state, always has its unique needs, particularly around packaging. But I think we can start to get some consistency. And I know as state officials, I'm sure you feel that way. One of my favorite, you guys probably know David Alloway. One of my favorite quotes from him is, "Harmonization is great as long as everybody harmonizes to us." It's like, okay, sure. But the other thing to keep in mind in terms of other products is there are cases of harmonized systems. The paint care program is almost exactly the same law in every state it's passed. And that's because the industry has come forward in a positive and productive way and said, hey, this is the system that works for us. And they've been constructive about those legislative discussions. And so there's definitely the opportunity to have more consistency among programs. I think electronics is the cautionary tale, right? The electronics industry could never kind of get itself fully organized, and therefore they have 25 different laws that are completely distinct and different from each other. I don't think that's going to be the case in packaging. I think they're going to coalesce around one or a couple of different sort of variations on the theme. Again, with those important pieces like who the producer is and what's covered and what those reporting and requirements and such are, will help a lot towards that consistency.
That's great. Thinking about having a consistent PRO is super beneficial to both the states and the manufacturers.
Mm-hmm.
So that can be a model that works very well, especially if you get the more states you get involved and are harmonized. Do you ever see national laws, federal, EPA, anything like that, regulations or laws, or do you think it's always going to be states?
Well, I mean, I'm super cynical when it comes to federal policy. I guess there's been some funding in the last few years, but prior to that, the last major federal policy was an executive order in 1993. The fact that we have a Congress that can't agree to basic things like keeping the federal government running does not give me great optimism. But there are folks who do believe that that's possible, and that with the industry push behind, particularly around some of the packaging stuff, that it could be possible. So I don't want to say never, but I don't think it's where I would spend my time.
Excellent. All right. Well, Melissa put a question in the chat. How do you suggest our state members prepare for engagement with PROs, such as the Circular Action Alliance?
I think that's a really good question. I think they need to know a lot from you. They don't understand how your systems work. So I guess one thing would be, kind of to temper your expectations in terms of what they'll know coming in. They are essentially, the PROs are compliance organizations, right? They're set up to meet an industry's obligation under these laws. So I would say going into those conversations, know what you want them to do. And if you know what you want them to do, don't be shy about being clear about what your expectations are, because ultimately they're compliance organizations. Ultimately, they don't know a lot about your state or what's happening on the ground in your state. They know what the law tells them they need to do. And so if you approach it as a bit of a partnership in terms of you laying out what your expectation is for their programs and and giving them kind of the background and information they need to be successful, I think that would be a really good place to start.
And that makes me think about how different EPR laws can be written where the state agency has a lot of responsibility and oversight and management and administration of the system, versus keep not bringing the money in through the state, but keeping it out in a PRO. Do you see, as state agencies, who we are here, what are the costs and benefits of each of those different approaches?
Well, my perspective on that is that I think it's important to have the producer responsibility organization, including the funding obligations, at arm's length from the state. I think it becomes very difficult for the state to enforce on performance if they are deeply engaged in delivering a program. So, for example, in the Maine situation where a producer responsibility organization for packaging is going to be operating on contract to the state agency, that producer responsibility organization may do everything the contract says it needs to do and still not achieve the program targets. And then I think it becomes difficult for the agency to enforce on the PRO or the producer since they're doing what the contract tells them to do, right? Whereas if you have a more conventional EPR structure where the producer responsibility organization is independent, it's funded by the producers, it's developing a program plan, and it's implementing that plan, and the agency, if it's not meeting the goals in the plan, then the agency can go to them and say, you have to revise your plan, you have to do things differently, this is the target you're trying to meet, and can hold them accountable to that target. I think the more engaged the agency gets in actual program delivery and in like deeply regulating the programs, the more difficult it is to hold the industry accountable for its piece. And for those of you who are regulators, if you think I'm crazy, I'd love to hear that. But it's just my point of view. I was a regulator for about 5 minutes, as those folks from New York know. But
yeah, and just raise your hand, chime in, open up your microphone. This is for us. Well, I'll just keep going on that since I'm not seeing any hands at the moment. In meeting the target goals, you mentioned earlier in your talk how the convenience standard was a very powerful way to do that.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting to focus on the convenience standard instead of on target rates.
Yeah, I think we did a study a few years ago. I think that was also while I was at PSI, looking at the performance of the different electronics EPR programs and like the correlation between performance and different program parameters and structural issues. And one of the things we found was that the programs that focused on rates and dates, like New York and Minnesota, where you had to collect a certain amount of pounds by each year, were not achieving as high numbers as those that required convenient collection sites. And I think that has held out as we've looked at other programs as well, which is why I think as we're looking at packaging programs, it's really important to think about not just hitting recycling targets, but also hitting convenience metrics. So Colorado, for example, and the New York law and some others have, or New York bill and some others have the standard that recycling has to be as convenient as trash. Not unlike Vermont and Delaware's universal recycling programs that say everybody who provides trash service has to provide recycling service. It's kind of a similar approach, but producer funded, if that makes sense. And I think we know that approach works, right? People have access. It really does improve their participation. Oh, you're muted, John, but I think you're calling on whoever raised their hand.
Yeah, it looks like Allison would like to
Hi,
ask.
I'm sorry. I was on another call and I joined in late. And I love the idea of having a group, a manufacturing group do the their own, like join together and do their own policing of the program, because Rhode Island, we do our own e-waste program, and it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
So if they want to do that, that's great. And but I did miss with the packaging programs. Do they have like a national group? Like Paint Care.
Yes, the
Yes,
Circular Action Alliance was created, I don't know how long ago, maybe a year ago. And they're now the selected producer responsibility organization in California, Colorado, and Oregon. So they're essentially operating, Maine has not gone through its contracting process yet, but so far every other state has selected CAA.
Okay. So if Rhode Island does adopt a packaging program, we could just kind of hop on that bandwagon and
yep, they would certainly come forward, and they will by that point have all of the producers engaged, because they're having to register over the next 6 months or so in Colorado and Oregon.
Yeah, because using ERCC with the e-waste just it made the whole program, like without it wouldn't happen.
Right.
So, okay. Thank you very much.
Any other questions for Resa? It's just been a great presentation. I really, I love how it's all comprehensive looking at it. We've all seen parts of it, but not seeing it all together. Well, if no one else is jumping on for a question, you know that I at NEWMOA am always available if you have questions that you want for the region to talk with other states. We even have a work group on EPR called the Northeast EPR Network. We do that with NERC, so it's a larger group with some of the other states. And please feel free to drop me a line anytime, jfay@nemoa.org. And Resa, what's your availability for folks?
Yeah, it popped up I hope you're seeing my contact information here. I have the best email in the business, resa@recycle.com. So yeah, happy to hear from folks, and if you have questions or need information or anything I can help you with, feel free to reach out.
Terrific. Great. Well, thank you so much for coming and presenting all your extensive knowledge, and we will see you around the block.
All right. Take care, everyone. Thank you for your time.
Goodbye.